Hi, everybody. Welcome to the PranaTech Podcast. I have with me today Chris Whelan out of ITL Biomedical. And, he brings an interesting background of, regulatory strategy as well as product development and just really focused on the medical device industry and what he's been doing for the past couple of decades. So, I'll let Chris intro himself and give us a little bit of a background.
Thanks, Amit. Thanks for having me. Excited to see what comes up today. So yeah, my name is Chris. I've been in medical device development for over 20 years. I live in California, but I'm from Australia. I just fell into medical device development. It wasn't really a choice, but looking back, it's a really rewarding challenge to be here. ITL Biomedical, we design, develop, manufacture, distribute single-use sterile devices. So we're not making machines or software or electronic kind of things. We really at sort of the lower end of the market with single-use disposables, really, really high volume, some commodity, some high value stuff, as well as assembling kits. So my exposure to medical devices is really at sort of that end of the field. But what I do find is that I can have conversations with people who are working on those larger projects, the software, the electrical ones, the class 3 and higher risk devices. And we're talking the same language because all the principles and all the requirements really still apply. So I've really enjoyed in the last couple of years sort of engaging people on LinkedIn. That's pretty much my only social media presence, actually. And I've really learned a lot. And that's how I met you. I met via LinkedIn, and we had a couple of exchanges as well, which were interesting. Interested to talk about a couple of topics with you.
Yeah. So that's awesome. So like talk about ITL Biomedical and what you guys do in terms of like your classification of devices and like what type of risk products that you worked with in the context of the company.
So as I said, we're sort of working in that I guess you'd call it the lower end of the space. A lot of class 1, class 2 for the US, class 1, class 2A devices in the European classification system. And a lot of those are actually accessories. So they're not actually the medical device. They're there to enable someone else's medical device to do its job. And that goes for IVDs as well as medical devices, what are doing accessories. We do medical devices too. But if you look at our portfolio online, you'll see a lot of those are actually accessories. But they're also really, I mean, we're fairly proud of the work that we've done because a lot of it's innovative. Almost everything you see in our portfolio has IP IP in terms of patents that were developed in-house. And then, of course, we've got our own IP in terms of manufacturing. And there's been some interesting manufacturing challenges to get there because when you're creating something new, you create a patent. The idea is that it's something that someone else hasn't done before. And so sometimes you're challenging the manufacturing methods and processes to get there. And that may have been the reason that somebody hasn't done it before. So we're very interested in having our IP via patents. We're very interested in working through those really tough manufacturing challenges to deliver products that basically no one else is interested in delivering. And so that puts ITL Biomedical into an interesting niche for biological sampling. But we're also servicing some markets with kits. Those kits also go to class 3, but at that point you're doing a kit. Someone else has done the conformity assessment on the product, you're packing it, and you just take on the classification. So that's not there's not as much IP or IP in general there, and that's a little bit more of a cost-constrained market. So that's not really what I'm excited about. I'm excited about those challenges that nobody else is tackling, and I think part of the reason that we get to tackle it is because we are in that sort of niche where your large companies, even though they've got the resources, the expertise, and the access to do them, they're just not interested because they want to make billions of dollars, not millions of dollars. And so that's where ITL is. We're a sort of a depends which currency you're using, but let's say a 20 million US company, and for that reason, there's some interesting perspectives that I've learned that I have that a lot of the other industry doesn't have. And that's where I've been really finding the LinkedIn discussions really useful because it does bring that perspective.
Yeah. No, that's a great word, like a niche environment, right? I think a lot of people they focus on, that the hotter trends, right? What's going to make you the most money, but there's something in between too, that can be definitely implemented I look at, AWS, for example, like cloud services, right? Obviously, they're the league leaders. They're up there with Microsoft, but there are a lot of smaller players too that are still underneath kind of that umbrella that are still multi-billion-dollar companies. Fine, they're not worth $100 billion, but $1 billion is enough, right? They're still living great. But the point is that I guess those companies kind of create markets for different companies, and you guys are one of those companies, right? In that sense, like you guys innovate in the regard to that context of what they need.
That's right. And in that sort of same concept of the niches, that there's certain things that the big guys, they just don't care about. They say, no, that opportunity is too small, but it's still a valid opportunity for someone, and there's still a market for it. There's still people who will benefit from whatever that is. And when we're talking about medical devices, at the end of the day, we're talking about benefit. So if there's no benefit to a patient or a user, then you've missed the point. If there's no benefit to a patient, you might as well be going and making shoelaces or fidget spinners or something. So yeah, and what it does mean too is that you are in this sort of niche in terms of how big you can get. Because if we're selling products for $1 versus $1,000, we got to sell 1,000 more to make the same amount of money. So growth then, which is interesting for us at the moment, because we're really the CEO of the company, he's very focused on a growth strategy, and a lot of that does mean thinking about, well, what do we need to do differently to what we're doing now to make that step in growth? And I think it's a question that happens across, it doesn't matter what industry you're in. You may start in a really, like say, for example, someone starts an airline. That's a very cost intensive, resource intensive, relatively low margin industry. But whatever you're selling in 4 and 5 sort of digits, rather than like, hundreds of dollars for a fare, thousands of dollars for a fare, in some cases, tens of thousands of dollars. That's your revenue. Whereas your smaller company, you're selling things that are going to give you a revenue of $1 or $10 or something like that. So the difference between creating a product that has that kind of revenue to the next step, adding a zero to your revenue, that's a totally different kind of business. So our CEO is going through that process now, trying to work out, well, what is that strategy? What can we move to based on what are our capabilities, both in terms of human resources, so people like me, our manufacturing skills, our sales and marketing expertise, quality and regulatory, etc. And it's exciting because it does mean that he needs to talk to everybody. He needs to talk to me about, well, how are we going to do this? Can you do it? And then all those other people as well. And because just back to what ITL Biomedical does is we do the design and engineering, we do the manufacturing, we do all the regulatory and quality in-house. So we're a fairly sort of, I think we call it, relatively vertically integrated company. We even have our own mold making workshop. So building on that, there's a lot of scope, at least in manufacturing. But then manufacturing might have it. Okay, maybe quality has it, maybe regulatory has it, but does R&D have it? Because at the moment, like I said, we don't do electronics, hardware, software. So if that's what we decide we need to do to add a zero to our revenue, how are we going to do that? And that's part of this strategy, which is, a set of principles around which to improvise. So anyway, I think I probably took it off a little bit from the original question there, Amit, but yeah, you asked what we're up to. So there you go.
Yeah, I was more curious about the statement about your CEO adding that extra zero, right? So that means like he's trying to scale, right? So scaling means that you need to talk to everyone to understand how much resources you need for this type of kind of scaling motive, right? So that's like, I don't think there's any right or wrong answer for that, but it's a tricky balance, and like, and I think that's where you kind of, how would you kind of go about like scaling in that regard? How does that work?
Well, I mean, I'm leaving the vision there to the CEO.
Yeah. Well, from the R&D end, I meant from the R&D end, yeah.
Okay, from the R&D end, it does depend on how we want to go about it. And just, okay, so I remember where we came into this conversation from. It was about, creating the products that are worth this value. To add a zero, now you're in a different space. And the big guys will attack these projects, leaving the little guys or the medium guys to tackle these projects. So you kind of got to move from the projects you are willing to tackle to the projects where you just said, no, that's too expensive, it's going to take too long, and it's too risky, given that we've only got $20 million a year or however much to spend on R&D. That's not how much we spend, but it's a number. I'll give you an example too, is it was a really, really great growth potential project that we shelved about 2 years ago. it was like I was going to add $10 to $15 million bottom line, but the cost to develop it wasn't unreasonable given the amount of revenue that it was going to generate. The ROI wasn't unreasonable given the amount of revenue that it was going to generate, but it just wasn't viable for a company of our size to take on that much risk or that much debt, because then you've got to worry about cash flow. How are you going to pay for it, given all your other operations as well? So that's a question of how, in terms of scaling, is that how we want to do it? Do we want to do it by just finding this bigger project that's worth more? Are we going to do it incrementally? Are we going to do it based on our existing capabilities, or are we going to go and acquire someone else? And that's another question that we have, because there are other companies that are similar size to us. It's like they're actually making the product that we wanted to sell. We're not doing it because we worked out they're probably doing it better than us. There's all these different approaches to scaling. And from an R&D perspective, definitely something that we need to consider is, are we going to continue to do it in-house? Because one very popular and recommended strategy to do this project or this new product development that's sort of outside your typical scope is to sort of set that off in its own little company almost. So it'll have its own business unit manager, it'll have its own R&D department, it'll have its own quality regulatory, it'll almost have its own quality system. So that if something goes wrong there, it doesn't affect your core operations. So that's an option there too. You could do it like that, or you could try to absorb it and say, well, all right, are we trying to spread ourselves too thinly? If our expertise is in single-use disposables, sterile devices, and now we go and try to make something with software or hardware, are we trying to know too much and do too much? So these are the questions from an R&D perspective. How are we going to tackle that? And I don't have answers right now because we haven't, really, it's not really a developed strategy at all. Just happened to be talking to you, just came up today. But I mean, I'm sure you've got some thoughts on that too.
Yeah. I want to kind of tie this into like design controls, right? So I think there's a big part of it, when you're creating any type of new product development strategies or whatever it may be. I mean, obviously your sales team and your marketing team are always on kind of, they have a pulse on the market, right? Especially from doctors, physicians, technicians, whoever the end user is. It could be patients, right? It doesn't matter. The point is that who's going to be using the product and what do they need from us to kind of get to the next stage, right? So how do you kind of interface with these teams like marketing and like sales, and like how does that really help you get a sense of like what R&D needs to kind of get to that next level, saying, yeah, we can create this or not create this? So it's like, I guess, call it a go or no go. Is that kind of exist in ITL?
Yeah. So if you're asking about how do we greenlight a project, is that kind of your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So at the moment in my organisation, as the R&D manager for my organisation, I'm heavily involved in the vetting and the feasibility of those opportunities. My sort of partner, I guess, in that is her role just in our organisation is called VP of Global Growth. So her job is to build those relationships, find those opportunities, look for the trends, and see how it fits in with our capabilities and our growth strategy. So that then comes back to, well, how are we planning on growing? Are we planning on growing by finding that multi-million-dollar project and doing it? Are we doing it incrementally? So that's her remit. We'll also get ideas that come in from the sales and marketing team, because as you point out, they're the customer-facing people. They're the ones who are likely to spot things and directly get that input as to what we need. But there's also something that has worked for us in the last couple of years is that those relationships might be, there's a hospital system or a university, they've got their own innovation center. The output to that, they're looking for commercialization partners. And so we've been successful at those sort of channels as well. The green lighting process, it's really, there's a little bit of like, let's call it pre-design control kind of activity there, because we're looking at really, really homing in on the chances of success. Is this actually going to bring the value that we expect it to, and at what cost? So there's a little bit of concept work that gets done with the design team. A little bit of, when I say pre-design control, it's kind of a little bit of that usability engineering, maybe a little bit of risk management, a little bit of regulatory strategy, because knowing things whether like, are you going to be able to do this via 510K in the US, or is it going to be a PMA or a de novo? These are things that are going to impact your cost, your timeline, the amount of burden you're taking on. So these are all questions we'll vaguely try to answer at the start, but only with enough resolution that we can go ahead with a matter of confidence, because you're never ever going to get to 100% confidence. And I think that's a real skill in leadership, especially, is knowing when you can make a decision. Because you can say, oh no, I need more information, and you just let that go on and on and on. But okay, that's the best way not to take any risk at all, is to never do anything. So you've got to be prepared, especially in any kind of leadership role, is just to accept every decision I make, there's a bit of risk. But that's what I get paid for. That's why those leadership positions get paid more than the person who's working in the factory or the person who's on the engineering team. It's because they're paid to take those risks and then be accountable for them. And okay, bad luck. Sometimes you made a sequence of really bad decisions. You're out, but you got paid in the meantime. You're doing your job. So to answer your question, I guess it is a collaborative process. We'll come up with a business case. It's almost like we call it a stage one. It's to say, all right, are we going to start spending more money on this? Because up until this point, we might have spent some of our time. That's an overhead, so we're not adding anything to the cost of the company. We may have done some customer visits, so there's a small expense there. We may have done some prototyping. That's almost immaterial most of the time. And then we decide, does it look like it can work? Does it look like we can sell it? Does it look like people are going to buy it? And that's probably the most important one, because if people aren't going to buy it, forget about it. You can have a great product, really good cost. Well, actually, no, that's related to why people are going to buy it. But, beautifully engineered product delivers this great clinical benefit. But if you didn't get your cost right, you didn't get your quality right, you didn't get it to market at the right time, someone else might beat you, or it might be superseded by some other alternative state of the art. You've missed the point. So ultimately, we're deciding with a project, are people going to buy it? And that's that first sort of green lighting phase.
Of course, yeah. And how does like IP strategy kind of tie into this? Like, when do you start focusing on intellectual property and really kind of developing that strategy after you get this green light, or is it before? How does it work? Like, from your experience?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it's a really tough one, because IP can be really costly, especially for startups and small companies. IP is always, at least in our case, we are very interested in making sure that as much as possible our products do have some kind of IP. And for the most part, that means a patent. And if it can't have a patent, then what's protecting it? Because if it's easy to copy, or if it's, because again, if you think about the sort of the band that we're working in, that ITL Biomedical is working in, or what I'm talking about from my experience, any other company that's about the same size or bigger is equally capable of spending that money to develop that product. So if there's no IP, but there's a market, then I go, okay, well, why don't I make that too? It's a gimme. I don't have to spend billions of dollars developing it. Maybe spend $1 million or $2 million developing it. Sweet. So really, the IP is important for us from the perspective of that's our strongest competitive advantage, because we're not big enough to be sort of, we brute force it. We're not big enough to go and acquire all the competitors. We're not big enough to sort of sweep the market. So we think about it right at that feasibility stage. Do we think that there's any IP here? And if we're not sure, can we get some, it sounds a little bit strange, but it's kind of shoehorn some IP in there. And sometimes, because IP is a really, really nuanced field, and that's why you have IP attorneys getting paid a lot to do it for you. There might be something very simple that you can do to the product design that does get some IP. And even if someone else can work around it, the fact sometimes that you can say this is patented is enough to just say, okay, I'm not going to tackle that, your competitors. So that's a little bit more psychological than practical, but it's all the thought process when we start. In terms of spending money on IP, that's after that sort of stage one kind of approval, because it starts to get expensive. And that's when we go, all right, are we going to spend money on this? Only if we think people are going to buy it, and then if it's going to have the right value. In terms of strategy looking forward, we do have to think about which countries are we going to do it in. Europe's got some really interesting pathways, I think, for IP. We can sort of get this unitary patent, I think it's called. UK is sort of this sort of satellite to the European rules, but not completely. There's a lot of nuance to it. There's considerations about, well, how soon can you disclose your design to users or at a trade show before you've actually lodged IP? Where was it invented? Do you lodge it in that country first? Is there priority based? There's a minefield there. So in fact, if there's anything that I think should be a takeaway from this portion of the conversation, is that you do need some legal advice on your IP. Don't go without it, because it's a waste of money if you get it wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, what I've learned from starting a business is, have a good lawyer and have a good accountant. Two powerful people in your organization.
That's right. And then if you call it a medical device company too, you also need a good RA and good quality managers as well. I think they're
Yeah.
I would add that definitely.
Yeah. Let's kind of dig into the whole regulatory strategy part too, right? So you work with different markets, and as you know, in the US, the quality system regulation, the QSR is changing from that to QMSR, which is quality management system regulation, right? So how are you guys tackling that, and what are your thoughts on that over the next year before the grace period ends, Feb 2026? So what are you kind of seeing in that paradigm?
I can speak from what we're doing in my company, and give you a sort of a hunch about what might be happening elsewhere. So ITL Biomedical, we already have Australia and Europe as key markets. So our quality management system is already set up to be based on 13485, because that gives you that presumption of conformity with the medical device regulation in Europe, allows you the CE mark, etc. So we're not too worried about it, because the QMSR is going to be 13485 is incorporated by reference. Then if you are 13485 compliant already, you're 99% of the way there. There's just a couple of clauses in the QMSR which you need to make sure you're not missing, very, very few. So if someone is already 13485 compliant, it's really not a big deal to actually then switch to the QMSR. In fact, I'm really, really looking forward to it, because it now means that there's not these two quite different systems that you've got to consider, and your regulatory strategy, your R&D strategy can be a little bit more singular, I suppose. That doesn't take away from the difficulty of getting a device to market in Europe, because it's so expensive and burdensome and time consuming. And there's a lot of conversation on that in the industry. And if you're asking about, what might be a little bit more of an industry opinion on QSR to QMSR, I know that there's still a lot of hard feelings about MDR and IVDR. I don't know what other of the other sort of electrical and hardware regulations have sort of been dragged along with that. But I do feel like within the last, since 2017, I think that was released. So what's that, in the last 8 years, the opinion of who's kind of got a more reasonable regulatory approach has completely flipped. Because people used to say it was easy to get CE mark and get into Europe than it was in the US, but that is absolutely totally flipped now. And with the FDA moving to QMSR, they've even made it a little bit easier. So the FDA, in my opinion, even though they cop a lot of criticism, that's just what you get as a government agency. But I think they do a relatively good job of engaging with industry, and their job is to make sure that good healthcare is available to patients in the US. And their regulations are the barrier to do that. So they're interested in making the regulations so that that's feasible for people and encourages people to do it and innovate. But they're also protecting public health. So I think there probably still is a little bit of apprehension about what the shift to the QMSR means for companies that have been totally focused on the US, because potentially those companies haven't been that interested in 13485, because you can get away with just your QSR compliance. But I don't know how many companies that would be, but I imagine that most medical device companies would at least know what 13485 is, have looked at it and see that there's a lot of harmony already with the QSR. And so shifting to QMSR is not a big deal. But those companies who've done that process, they'll be fine. Those ones who are kind of a little bit sort of just closing their eyes and just hoping that it's going to be okay, there may be some problems, because the FDA is a little bit more direct about what's in and what's out in terms of your, making a regulatory submission for a new product.
Yeah, that's a good point. How about, I guess, the intersection of, let's say, having this QMSR in place, right? Let's say you're abiding to it as a U.S. manufacturer, And yeah, you're pretty much, you pass the audit in terms internal audit, but you want to go for an ISO 1345 certification. Does that make, like, would you recommend a U.S. manufacturer doing that? And like, if you were to make that recommendation or not to, what is the benefits, or what are the advantages or disadvantages?
That's that's a great question, actually. And I'd asked that a little while ago to the LinkedIn community. There were mixed responses to it. On the one
Yeah.
hand, it doesn't seem like a very like that next bar to get the 13485 certification is that much higher. And so from
Right.
that
Right.
perspective, you say, well, I might as well. But then the next bar to make use of that 13485 certification, oh, just to be clear too, is to be compliant with QMSR, you don't need the certification, which I think is where you're coming from.
Yeah.
Um, but to make that certification useful, you'd be then trying to sell products into a CE mark recognizing area like Europe, Australia, the various other areas that recognise the CE mark too. That next step to clear that bar is really, really a lot further away. So you got to
Mm.
ask, if you were to take that step of getting the 13485 certificate, why are you doing it? Are you doing it so you get access to Europe? Are you doing it because your customers are asking for it? Or are you doing it just because it sounds nice? And if it's the third option, just because it sounds nice, well, you're not adding value at all there. You're not
Yeah.
you're not improving your company at all. That's my opinion. But again, as we said before the call, I'm medical device R&D. I'm not quality. I'm not regulatory. But my interest is in making sure that the new products that we develop, people are going to buy them, and that involves the quality and regulatory. So
Right. Right.
that's my opinion.
Yeah. And how are like the regulations between those markets that you guys are focused on influence you in a sense, right? Because I guess my question is, like, you're selling one product in three different markets. What does that do to the design based on those regulations? Like, you guys kind of make a trace matrix and say, like, where these things overlap, don't overlap, or does the design change based on certain markets in a slight way, so you can actually be compliant towards those regulations?
I think there are some examples where the design could change, but in practice, for the kind of devices that we're doing, that doesn't happen. The examples I can think of are potentially to do with material selection. Europe's a little bit more stringent in terms of substances of very high concern. It's got its REACH regulation. Some they're a little bit more forward in terms of life cycle of materials. They've got it's not regulated, but it seems like they're moving towards things like mass balancing, uh, packaging, these kind of things, and I think that will happen before the US. So in terms of design selections, that may become a more important choice you have to make. But from our perspective, doing R&D on devices, what we're focused on is making a device that people are going to buy. The
Right.
regulations are the permission to sell that product to them. So really that comes down to, how do we document our decisions? How do we do our risk management? So it's a little bit more on the documentation side, because what we're interested in is devices that are safe, effective, and usable. And so it doesn't matter whether I'm selling those to people in Europe, Australia, Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, or the US. Those three things are kind of universal, because they're all going to human beings who will make mistakes, who get sick, who, that's sort of something that's common for all humans, as much as we feel like we're different sometimes. As we all get sick, we all make mistakes. We all have a learning curve when we pick up something new. What Europe requires, what the medical device regulation requires of us in terms of how do we document our decisions, is a little bit different to what FDA requires. But if you look at what their role is to make sure that they're not letting things that aren't safe, that aren't effective, that aren't usable into their markets. But they're the three things that are universal, in my opinion. And so, to answer your question about, do we treat the design differently? The work that we're doing, no. The documentation side, yes, obviously, because there are different requirements. You've got your technical
Yeah.
documentation requirements for CE marking, and it's quite different for FDA.
Got it. Got it. No, yeah, I understand. Makes sense. So what are some of the hottest trends that you're seeing right now, like in terms of the industry as a total, but even within your sub industry and your niche environment? Like, what's kind of going on that piques your interest?
Probably three things I can think of. One is that a lot of customers are asking for uh, more kind of sustainable options. packaging of single sterile devices is a really obvious bit of waste that fills up the biohazard waste or the trash cans in hospitals especially. And nurses for the most part are the ones unwrapping and throwing these things away, and so they're very interested in seeing how can this be better. You, the manufacturer, you've got to do something about this. So whether it's better materials that can be recycled or mass balanced or just less material, they're interested in that. And in terms of it being a trend, well, as I mentioned, Europe is moving towards regulating that. Australia has regulated it for food waste, food and organic matter. It's only a matter of time before it starts to be imposed on things like the medical device industry or other sort of more controlled industries. And the reason I think that we haven't had to do that yet is because there are other requirements of medical devices that sort of supersede the sustainability requirements, and that is, for the most part, sterility. So if you can't get a material that can keep the product sterile in its package, last the shelf life that you want to print on it, and still deliver safety and effectiveness to the patient, then don't worry about sustainability. Make sure the patient is safe and gets their treatment. So, but I do see that changing. And sometimes we see governments, and I think this happened in Australia. It happens often in Australia, actually. There was just recently, they pushed through the social media ban for kids under 16. And that was, I think, government brute force. That's my opinion on that. But that's just an example where if the government thinks that there's something socially responsible to do, they're going to push it through whether the industry is ready or not. And so that's a trend I think we've got to keep an eye on. Because the governments who are implementing those regulations may not be that sensitive. Oh, FDA and the LDT rule, they push that through brute force, and there's still a lot of opposition to that. So
yeah,
we got to watch out for more of that.
Elizabeth Holmes.
Yeah, well, I mean, thankfully that all turned out, I think, in the public interest. But yeah, in the meantime, there was a bit of a problem there. Yeah. The other trends too, I mean, AI, obviously. We're not working in that space because we're not working with software or electronics. But obviously, if you're not taking an interest in how that can benefit your organization, then you're way behind the eight ball. And then the third one is, God, it mustn't have been that important if I forget it. Oh, personally, you asked for our space, what are some of the trends that we're sort of looking at? Patient blood management. So there's a lot of research at the moment looking at the value of transfusions in surgery and as it relates to effective treatment, but then also anemia in patients. Because anemia is actually a worldwide, I can't remember if the terminology from the WHO is a health emergency or health crisis or something. It's largely related, largely in certain populations, especially female populations between certain ages. But these are the same people who might need to go to hospital. They might be in a car accident. They might need surgery. And so that anemia becomes a bigger problem. It can actually, in certain cases, step by step, be a contributing factor to death. So the sort of forward-thinking hospital systems are looking at, well, how do I just not have to waste as much blood from my patients? And one of those areas is transfusion medicine, where they say actually not giving a patient a transfusion is better than giving them a transfusion. By that I mean, you get your bag of whole blood. They've lost blood during surgery. Let's put someone else's blood in them. By doing that, we're reducing the demand for blood. And at the moment, the American Red Cross and several other organisations are saying there's a global blood shortage. So there does seem to be an interest, and potentially it's one of those sort of because we're actually focusing on it, we realise there's a bit of literature and a bit of demand for it, but it does seem fairly contemporary. And so that actually has implications across treatment in transfusion medicine, phlebotomy, critical care units, anywhere where patients are getting daily blood samples, women's health, all these areas. So that's something we're keeping our eye on, and I think we will see more of that in the public domain as well.
Yeah, it's a nice diverse range of what the future looks like, but that's great. I'm definitely looking forward to that, and also looking forward to like the regulatory controls and the design controls of those things, because that's definitely needed. But I guess give a take-home message to, I would say, the younger generation, people who are trying to get into R&D, get into kind of in the med tech, med device space, but don't have the experience but they're very interested in kind of like things that you're doing. What kind of recommendations or advice would you give them to kind of, put them on the right path for that track?
Good question. Because here's what I would have told myself 20 years ago. It is a really fulfilling thing to do because it's challenging and you are automatically given a purpose in the medical device industry, because what you do is meant to benefit people, benefit patients and users. That's the only reason you're there in the medical device industry, is to deliver benefits to patients and users. And to do that, and to do that well, you've got to be competent at what it means to be developing medical devices versus developing fidget spinners or remote controls or something else. So what I wish I'd understood and grasped much earlier in my career is that I shouldn't expect someone else to provide that knowledge for me. You've really got to go out there and be proactive about getting that knowledge. And the good thing about a regulated industry is that everything is written down. The company you work for will have SOPs. The industry is regulated via standards and regulations. Read them. Look at the free information online. Use LinkedIn to engage with people. Follow the experts. Just read one thing a day. I feel like if I'd done that much earlier in my career, if I'd taken responsibility for my own learning, I'd be 10 years advanced from where I am now. I mean, I don't look back with resentment on that, but I do think that that is a really, really important leg up that you can give yourself in a regulated industry, because everything is out there. It's not dark art. It's not a secret thing. It's, it's easy to find. So go and do it.
I agree a million percent. I would say people who take the initiative, create opportunities for themselves. There's no such thing as luck, in my opinion. Fine, there is. I think that you create your own luck by taking more chances. Like you were talking about risk, right? If you're stagnant, you're going to be there for X amount of days, maybe years, maybe your whole life. But you can make that change tomorrow. And then, someone like Chris will reach out saying, hey, we have an opening. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's where the greatest entrepreneurs the tech startup CEOs, they took that risk. They went out there, they did some homework. They said, I can do this. They took action.
Yeah. But I would say thanks for your time today, Chris. Thanks for joining me, and thanks for giving your insights on the markets, what you do, and what the kind of future holds in the industry. So I appreciate you again, and look forward to connecting.
Pleasure to talk, Amit. Thank you.
All right, thank you.